Yeah, you can go ahead and record and we'll get started. So let me just start by saying broadly that a lot of what we are going to do today is really come into some of the more Moodle specific elements from a really high altitude. And that's because I think that in my conversations around accessibility and accessible design when it comes to courses, Megan and I were having this conversation earlier this week, and this seems to fit with her understanding too, that the conceptual ideas behind accessibility are actually kind of pivotal and crucial to really coming up with accessible course designs by and large, because as the technology advances, the technology itself does a pretty good job of sort of walking us through checklists around things that make sure our design is accessible. But that doesn't necessarily always create the most forward designs when it comes to accessibility. And so part of what I want to do today is start really, really broad about accessibility, about some of the principles and practices around accessibility, so that hopefully that gives some context and helps shade a little bit of what our experience is when we use the Addo editor in Moodle, or when we are using the accessibility toolkit, if our institutions make that available to us, or when we're using the accessibility checker that's built into the editor. So we kind of know what that tool is doing and what it's looking for, because it's entirely possible to pass the checker, and it's entirely possible to sort of get the thumbs up when it comes to the very, very basics around headings and tables and all those kinds of things, in no small part because the tool helps do a lot of that work for us. But it's also possible to do that and not really understand what accessibility is about and some of the bigger picture things in there. And we'll talk about how that actually being able to understand that, sort of knowing what accessibility is about, is one of the core principles, the robust principles. So we'll talk about that in a little bit. So we're going to start very, very broad. We are going to work our way towards some of the more specific stuff. And if you're familiar, I mean, those of you working in Moodle on a regular basis know Moodle does a lot of great work for on our behalf anyway when it comes to accessibility, and so there won't be tons of new ground there, but I really want to lay some good foundational ideas for what it is that we do. So let's start as broad as we can, and let's say, what is accessibility? What are we talking about when we talk about accessibility, or including accessibility as one of the elements of our design? And really, we're talking about the ability of learners and users who have diverse abilities, diverse skill sets, learning styles, even, to access and then make use of educational resources and information, right? So it's really very straightforward in a lot of ways. When we make something accessible, we actually increase the ability of learners and users to take advantage of what it is that we've designed, to present the information that we've given them, for them to be able to access it, digest it, express it, play it back for us, and indicate how they've learned it, right? Not surprisingly, because people who think about this are educators and they like to group things and make it very communicable, we can break accessibility down into sort of 4 basic principles. And I think that these 4 principles, they're all interrelated with one another. They intertwine quite a bit, but when we stop and we talk about them and we look at them, to me, they play an important guiding role for how we think about course design. And I'm going to say this probably multiple times throughout this entire talk, but one of the things that to me is so pivotal when we talk about accessible design is that when we're doing accessible design well, we're not just improving the design for people who have disabilities or for people who have needs that require accessibility. We're actually improving the design for every single person who takes advantage of the course that we're designing. So accessible design is actually good for everybody when it's done really well, because it increases, as we'll see, at least in these 4 areas right here. So the 4 accessibility principles that we're operating with are that the course design is perceivable, that it is operable, that it's understandable, and that it's robust. My favorite one is the robust one. It's kind of the hardest one to grasp in some ways. So we'll talk about that one last. When we talk about perceivable, accessible design being perceivable, what we mean is that the information and the user interface components, that is the things that we are putting on the screen that make the information available to learners and to users, has to be presentable in ways that all of them can perceive. Now that seems obvious, but until we realize lots of folks don't use all of the same senses that, for example, I might use when it comes to perceiving information on a screen. So the obvious thrust here is when we design courses, depending on the kind of course, of course, but when we design courses, oftentimes they're very text forward. We're using documents, Word documents or Google Docs. We're using PowerPoint documents. We're using textbooks themselves. Oftentimes we are putting things that require visual perception onto the screen. And that is the primary way that we want to communicate to our learners, to our students, what it is that we want them to know. The challenge, of course, is that many of our learners and our users won't use their sight sense in the same way that I might use mine, right? And they may have to use some sort of assistive technology that helps with that. They may be using some sort of other intervention, but they're not all learners are using all of the senses equally. But those of us who create courses as faculty members or as designers, those of us who are working with the technology bear a certain responsibility to make sure that the information that we present, that we give to our learners is in fact perceivable. The second principle is that it is operable. And here we're really getting to the interface components and the ways in which users and learners navigate through our courses. It's interesting, in preparation for this, I was reading a little bit about accessibility guidelines and course design, and there's an interesting kind of nerdy debate about whether or not an online course would be considered a web application or a web page, right? And I tend to geek out on those kinds of things, so I was having a lot of fun reading about that. But even if we consider it a web page or we consider it a web application, the fact remains that our learners have to engage with and navigate through it. If that's just clicking next so that they go into the next section of their week or of their module, if it's moving into a navigation menu so they can look at grades, so they can look at their assignments, in some way or another, they have to operate the course using commands, using buttons, using interfaces, using navigation tools. And just like perceivable, the operable one seems like it would be obvious, except that a lot of learners come to the course and they navigate it not using the same senses that I might have been using when I designed the course, right? So they may be using assistive technology or some other form of intervention that allows them to navigate that isn't, for example, this is the obvious, the most obvious one, that isn't a mouse, right? So we often think around operating a course, operating or navigating our way through a course, we just put our hand on the mouse and we move the mouse and we click on the things that we want. But if that's not something that's available to me, then suddenly that becomes inaccessible, right? So operable is the second principle of accessibility. The third is understandable. And this one is so basic that it's almost one of those, when you see it, like, well, why did we have to include understandable? But the reality is, we do in fact have to interpret what's happening on the screen. And because of design conventions that have existed around websites and web applications for a long time, we tend to interpret things that we see visually, perhaps, automatically, and we know what they mean. A great example of this is a hamburger menu, if you know what I'm talking about. Anytime you see those 3 or 4 little stacked lines up in the corner of an object on your screen or up at the top of your page, you tend to automatically know and assume that if you click on that, some sort of menu is going to drop down and give you navigation choices. But of course, if visually you're not in a place where you're able to interpret that, or if mechanically you're not in a place where you can navigate to that using a mouse, that understandability goes away, right? And it's no longer understandable. So understandability actually sort of underpins a lot of what we've got going on, because in order for something to be perceivable, in order for it to be operable, we first have to be able to understand what we see on the screen. And so accessibility really strives to make sure that the content and everything else that goes around the content can be understood by the person using it. Near the end of our talk today, we're going to talk a little bit about usability and some usability considerations even beyond accessibility. And when we get there, we'll talk a little bit about what it means to intuit things. But understandability has a lot to do with really kind of unpacking what we think a learner or a user can intuit from what they see on the screen or from what they experience on the screen. And what we'll find when we get there is that we really want to get away from requiring people to intuit. Intuit is in many ways sort of opposed to understanding, right? Understanding is when we piece things together because of the clues that we've been given, whereas intuit often means that we're using our senses in sort of a subconscious way almost. Let me keep going here with understandability. This idea of inference, intuitiveness, or interpretation. It's not that you can't have things that require interpretation. That's almost always going to be required, or that's always going to be necessary. But what we want is every piece or every tool that needs to be interpreted has to be straightforward or self-explanatory in its own right, so that it doesn't require one sense, or it doesn't require a specific set of tools. It doesn't require just your eyes. It doesn't require just your mouse in order to make sense out of it or to understand it. Some examples of this, and we'll come back to this, right? But when we embed web links into texts, right? This is a great example of understandability. We don't want folks to have to make inferences around what it is that we've done, right? So if you look in this paragraph on the screen, you'll notice that I've got two different texts written on there. Now, those of us who are sighted and use our sight to make inferences and to make assumptions about interpretations about what's going on, we know where those links are automatically, right? Because our eye is drawn to the fact that they're both underlined and they are a different text color. And we know enough about web design, and we've engaged enough with web applications on our phones and on computers that we instantly know that those are links. But for someone who is using some sort of assistive technology like a screen reader, for whom sightedness is not a primary sense that's being used, both of those features, the different colored text and the underlined part of it, are not perceivable and they're not understandable. And that impacts their operability, right? So the way that we build these things doesn't mean we have to get away from using the different colored text or the underlined elements of it, but the way that we build these has to include the possibility that our learners are going to be doing something different with the text than just merely perceiving it with their eyes, right? So for example, a screen reader is a special technology that's going to read through this text. When the screen reader gets to the very first example that we have on the screen here, the one that says the Open Textbooks for Rural Arizona website is here, it is going to flag to the person who is reading this that this is a hyperlink to another website, but it's going to read out loud what the link actually says, which is the Open Textbooks for Rural Arizona website is here. Now, when the screen reader gets to the second example of what we've got underlined, the one that says https://www.opentextruralalaz.org, what the screen reader is going to do is the exact same thing. It's going to flag that this is a link, and then it is going to read out loud exactly what is on the screen. Now, if you are listening and trying to follow along rather than using your eyes, and the screen reader reads out loud to you, here's a link, https://www.opentextruralalaz.org, that's going to be not at all usable to you, right? So this is a great example of what we talk about when we talk about understandability, but really this is kind of an example that gets at all of them. And this is why we code links the way that we do. And we'll talk about that, of course, when we get to some of the specific stuff at the end here. Finally, we talk about robust as being the fourth, and in many ways, I think one of the biggest principles behind what we've got going on when we talk about accessible design. Mostly what this means is that we always deploy best practices um, that can be interpreted reliably as often as possible in a way that allows accessible design to be updated every time technology moves forward, um, simply and easily without having to go all the way back to the drawing board in order to make it happen. Part of the reason that we take time to code hyperlinks the way that we do, part of the reason that we take time to design web pages, content pages, assignments, anytime we're putting text into the auto editor, part of the reason that we organize it the way we do is because once it exists in that page, when technology advances, when it's able to make things and content more accessible for folks, the accessible content that we've already designed can travel with it. When we don't do that, right, and when we're not practicing that, then when the technology advances, when things move forward, we often find ourselves having to go back in, redesign the content so that it can keep up with the technology. The way accessible technology tends to advance is that it builds off of what already exists because it wants to preserve what already is out there in the world, right? Because there's just not capacity worldwide to have to redesign everything that happens or everything that exists once the technology moves forward. This is why I think it's important to always start at the beginning when we talk about accessibility and really hammer at these principles and this kind of high level stuff, is because when we understand this, it's so much easier to build robustly available and accessible content that our learners and that our students and our users can keep up with. A good way of saying this is that all of the formats, the structures, the conventions that already exist in place are what gets built on when progress happens, right? So it's rarely carte blanche that we would start all over and come up with something new, but we take what already exists and then we make it even more accessible as we're able to. Another thing that I'd like to talk about, although this isn't necessarily specifically about accessibility in the most strict sense, is something called universal design. And universal design principles are a little bit more, or even more broad, perhaps, than some of the accessible design principles. But I really think that they get at the sort of philosophy and the approach that all course design is really about. And the three universal design principles are universality and representation, and expression, and engagement, right? So if the four accessible principles are really about how we're arranging content and how we're reproducing content for our students to engage, the universal design principles are kind of on the flip side of that. And they're really sort of the theoretical or conceptual approaches to what it is that we're trying to accomplish with our students. When we talk about representation, what we mean is that we want to provide multiple and flexible methods of representation that give students with all kinds of learning styles and abilities and special needs various ways of acquiring information and knowledge. We want to represent this information in as many different ways as we possibly can so that we can present it and represent it to our learners of all sorts and all kinds, regardless of what kind of abilities that they're bringing with us. This isn't always like, we don't, this isn't a checklist kind of thing. So if it's a text oriented class, if it's a literature class and we're going to be doing a lot of reading, obviously it's going to be very text forward. But where we have opportunities to present our course materials in ways that are diverse and that have multiple methods of representation, then that's what we want to do, because that casts the net as broadly as possible in terms of who's going to be able to access all of that information. The second one is expression, and it's really the kind of same thing. We want multiple and flexible methods of expression that give all of our students with diverse learning styles and needs different ways of displaying how they have learned and processed. In other words, when we ask them to express, whether that be through assignments, through discussions, participation, assessments, Are we only operating within one lane or one channel, or are we moving as broadly as possible and allowing as many different methods and ways of expressing that? This is where online education actually shines, right? Because in my day and age, before people really used computers actively in the classroom, you were very limited here, right? You turned in a paper or you participated in a class discussion. Maybe you did some kind of creative poster project, but by and large, it was very text and discussion forward, and that was about all you had. But we have so many tools now that allow students to engage in a variety of different ways and allows them to express with one another and with us as faculty what it is that they're processing, how it is that they're processing their information, and what sense they're trying to make out of it. The last one is engagement. And again, it's the same basic principle. We provide multiple and flexible methods of engagement. Think of students from all over the place, ways of engaging each other, ways of engaging us as a faculty, and ways of engaging the information and the knowledge. And again, this is where online learning has really expanded the opportunities for learners with diverse learning styles and abilities in ways that traditional face-to-face classroom teaching probably never did, because there really are so many tools at our fingertips that allow us to do this. Okay, now we can narrow in a little bit and talk a little bit about some of the specific areas of accessibility that tend to pop up the most, I think, when it comes to course design. And frankly, Megan and I were talking about it. In many ways, if you were in a training session on Canvas or Blackboard or Desire to Learn or just about any other LMS, you would probably find a very similar, if not the same list of issues that tend to pop up. But these are the ones that show up the most anytime I'm doing course reviews. I can tell you these are the ones that show up the most when we use accessibility checkers or when we're using a checklist. But I think that these are the ones that also, and we sort of had a great conversation in the earlier iteration of this training earlier this week around when we think about these things, they also impact the way we as designers and faculty think about our course content. So I want to spend a little bit of time talking about these, unpacking what some of them are. But again, the idea here is that we really want to talk about some of the philosophical and conceptual underpinnings here, because the tools will do a lot of work for us when it comes to checking this. But what the tools can't do is really help us think about these from the get-go when we're thinking of what kind of content we want to bring to our students and how we want to bring that. The first thing that I want to talk about, and this one is where I think we can have a lot of really interesting conversation, is the idea of headings. So when you're in Moodle, whether it's anytime you're in the text editor, right? If you're building an assignment, if you're building a page, if you're building an activity, anything that you're adding to your class, to your course page, and you're building text, you have the opportunity and really the responsibility to use headings as a way to organize your content. Now, the conversation we had earlier this week, and I resonated so much with the person who was bringing this up, because I too grew up, my first education into computers was via word processors, right? And so I took a typing class, and then you take a word processing class. And then maybe in my day and age, maybe by the time you got to college, you could take a class where you got to learn how to use Excel or something like that. But working in Microsoft Word or Google Docs was one of the first ways that I learned to think about content and how to build it when you're in an online environment. And so, as you know, Word is often unwieldy when it comes to formatting, and it can be a little bit of a nightmare and a headache. And so the easy thing to do, anytime you want to draw out some kind of content, you want to separate it from the rest of it, you want to highlight it, you want to make it something that somebody's going to pay attention to, is you select it and bold it, or you select it and you put it in italics, or maybe you change the font size so that it's a little bit bigger or a little bit smaller. All of those things are very simple and easy to manipulate in the tool itself, and they're a great way of breaking up content. The problem is, when we move into an online environment like an online course in Moodle, those kinds of changes, merely bolding something, merely putting it into italics, putting extra spaces, changing the font size. A screen reader or assistive technology can recognize that, but it doesn't interpret that. in any way, if that makes any kind of sense. So bolded text to a person who's using a screen reader doesn't look like extra emphasis or special emphasis on the text necessarily. And if it does, it doesn't necessarily look like you're calling out a new section or a new content area. That's where headings are unbelievably important, because when a text reader, when assistive technology is reading through the text, and maybe it's helpful to remember that the assistive technology is not reading the words on the page like we who have sight are reading the words on the page. It's actually reading the coding that's under the hood, that's underneath those words, right? And so the way that we signal to a text reader or to any other assistive technology, the hierarchy of the information and the way we ordered it is by the use of headings, because that's how the text reader perceives and understands what we've done on the screen. So headings enable users, all of our users, to quickly navigate a page or a document when they're using their assistive software, and it gives some structure to the sections that we put on there. It actually improves the readability of the content. Right now, this is one of those places where we say good design benefits everybody, right? And accessible design is good for everybody, because the more clear we are in how we organize our content, the more specific we are in how we want to break it up, how we want to chunk it, how we want to make different sections relate to other things, the better that is for everybody. The reality is, no matter how attentive you are, a reader, when you're on a page or on a screen looking at paragraph after paragraph after paragraph or page after page after page of text content, text heavy content, that gets exhausting for a little while, right? Screens are not pages, and engaging them is different. So anytime we can break up content, anytime we can use headings as ways to signpost and flag for our learners what it is that we want them to pay attention to, what it is that we want to call out as being different than what they've read so far, then we're doing all of our learners a service there. And headings are a great way to do that. In Moodle, when you're in the Addo editor, Moodle actually makes this super, super simple for you. And rather than having to tag it or code it the way that you would in the HTML with the H1, H2, H3, or H4, or even H5 tag to determine what size your heading is going to be, Moodle actually gives you three. You got small, medium, and large, right? And that's the H2, H3, and H4 level. If you know anything about HTML coding, those are the tags that get applied to there. The reason you don't have the largest one is because when you're in your Moodle page, the course title at the very top of your page is always going to be your H1 or your highest level heading in the hierarchy. And so Moodle actually makes it so that you can't compete against the name of your course. Everything else is going to be down the chain in the hierarchy of information from the title of your course. So it really is simple to think through, how do I add a heading? All you have to do is select the text that is your heading. And then in the text styles drop-down menu that's in the Addo editor menu, you just pick which one you want to apply, the small, the medium, or the large one, right? And it will automatically format it for you, and it'll put that on the page. And the advantage there is, one, you're communicating to all of your students, even the ones who are reading directly onto the screen, how you're organizing the material. But now you have coded into the page itself how any assistive software is going to interpret what's just happened on the page for the person who is reading that. Another area, and we just talked about this a little bit, so we don't have to go super in depth here, is hyperlinks. Inevitably, when we're building content in Moodle, whether it be in an assignment where we want to link to something else that they need to view or access, or whether it's in text material, information, and content where we link to something that we want to read as supplementary material or as primary material, inevitably we're going to embed hyperlinks into that text, which is great because that is the beauty of being online, right? We have so much more access to different kinds of content. However, in order to do that well in a way that can be accessible, there are two basic principles that we have to follow. Number one, we have to make sure that we are designing with consistent link behavior in mind, and we'll talk about in a moment what that means. And then we also have to use descriptive links, and we can go quickly through that because we've kind of already talked about it in some ways. When we talk about consistent link behavior, in other words, the learner, the user should not have to try to interpret link by link what's going to happen when they click on the link. Rather, it should be kind of clear and consistent what happens when we click on a link. The standard rule, sort of the golden rule here, is that if I have a link that is linking to somewhere else in the course, so if I'm on a page and I'm reading a description of an assignment and then it links to the assignment, that link is actually going to open in the same window. The idea being that if I'm in one section of the course and I'm going to navigate to another section of the course via this link, I don't need both sections of the course open at the same time, right? So if it's within the course that I'm linking to, that will open in the same window. If, however, the link is going to take us outside of the course into an external site, that's when we want it to open it in a new window. And the idea there is exactly the opposite. I might still need to stay in the course, close to my assignments that I need to submit, close to other information, but now I want to open up in a separate window the content that I'm supposed to be viewing as well. When we talk about descriptive links, and again, we just talked about that, this is just using an actual description of what the link is and then embedding the link underneath that rather than just dropping the link. Now, there is a sort of spectrum here. So a plain URL such as moodle.org, we don't ever want to use that because that is going to be a mouthful. That's a short one, but as you know, some URLs are very, very long. And so when the screen reader tries to read that out, that's going to be a nightmare for anybody who has to listen to that. Better, but still not quite all the way there, is when we say something like click here. Again, here means something when you can see where the here is, but when you're using assistive software technology to navigate that click here doesn't mean quite the same thing. So click here to explore Moodle in action, for example, is descriptive, but in the sense that it's not just the URL in a raw sense, but it doesn't really describe what's happening, right? So what we want to do is we want to say what's going to happen descriptively when you click on the link. Explore Moodle in action on the Yavapai College site, for example, describes what happens when I click on the link. Don't need to identify that it's a link. The screen reader already knows that it's a link, right? Those of us who are using our site to perceive it, we know that the different colored text and the underline means that it's a link already. So what we want to do is we just want to highlight what's going to happen when I click on that. If we want to add descriptive links in Moodle, it's really quite simple. And this is actually true for just about every technology, but it's the same in Moodle. We select the text that we want to turn into our link. We go to the link button in the Addo editor and we click on that. We drop the URL there. And then we have the option now, remember, if it's going to an external website, then we can choose open in a new window. And if not, then we leave it as is, and then we hit create link. And suddenly now that link is embedded in the descriptive text that we have in our page. Inevitably, we're going to have tons of text in our pages, right? And so there are ways in which we want to format text, even beyond headings, that matter a great deal. Almost without fail, you want to use a sans serif font. Moodle is able to interpret just about every sans serif font, and there are dozens and dozens that are very web friendly, but sans serif fonts are almost always the go-to recommendation for any kind of reading that happens on a screen. When we want to call out information, and again, this is kind of reiterative in some ways of the heading stuff, but when we want to call out information, we want to put it into separate paragraphs, right? And we want to say we are calling out this as important information. Merely using bold, merely using italics, underlining, changing the font color, those are all visual cues. And for folks who are not using visual, their visual senses as their primary perceptive sense, those visual cues don't translate and they won't mean much, right? One thing that's very useful to know about the Addo editor in Moodle is that anytime you're importing text that has some of these features, bold, italics, some of the things that we don't want, you can highlight the text and just hit the clear formatting button that exists up in the menu ribbon in the text editor, and it will take all of that away and put it back to its plain basic sense. So that's a nice thing to know about how to clear out formatting that exists already in the text. One thing that pops up all over the place, and again, this is true for every tool, but especially for Moodle, is tables. Now, tables are a very useful design tool. They're a great way to build columns, rows. They're a great way to present text that isn't just huge chunks or paragraphs, but tables have to be designed and coded in a particular way in order for assistive technology to work for them. All tables require captions, meaning that you have to put essentially a title on that. Most people, in my experience, do put a title. They put a title by typing in a sentence whatever the title of the table is. The problem is the screen reader won't interpret that as the title of the table. So there's a specific way that you put the title or the caption into it. And the headings can be either in rows or in columns, but there have to be headings in your rows or columns. Again, without those, a screen reader isn't going to be able to interpret what's happening in a table for the person. So the text editor will add these elements and will flag them, right? So when you do the accessibility checker, it will tell you that these are not there and will ask you if it wants to add them, right? But it is smart to be thinking about when you put a table in, the need to do this. One of the most common things that I see when it comes to tables is we end up with more than one, sometimes two, it seems like 2 or 3 captions or titles for a table, because the person who's building it will put it in there, and then they might put a descriptive sentence underneath there about what it is. But then the accessibility checker will require that you add another one that's actually coded into the table. And before you know it, you've got 3 different pieces of text that are describing what the table is. That itself becomes cumbersome and a little bit hard to interpret. Images. Anytime you use an image, images are so easy in Moodle because if you're using the Atto editor and you've got an image close by, you can just grab it and drop it right into your text editor and it will show up there. That's a lovely feature, right? But all images have to use alt text, right? So again, screen readers don't read images, or they do read the text around images, but they can't interpret the picture itself. If the image is essential to what you've included it with, then you have to include the alt text tag. Anytime you drop an image into Moodle, anytime you drop it really into any kind of document, it will give you the opportunity to add the alt text. Alt text can't be the file name, right? So oftentimes Moodle will try to interpret the file name as the alt text, but you can't do that. It has to be a very short and descriptive identifying phrase. If it is a picture of a nurse administering a shot to a child, then your alt text would be a nurse administers a shot to a child. So it could be very straightforward. There's a little artistry. You get to create what the alt text is, but it does need to be there. Otherwise, that image is completely lost for people who aren't using sight as their primary sense. When we use documents, and this is another common area when it comes to accessibility issues, when we use documents, and this is especially true for Moodle, if you have the opportunity to use Office 365 documents, that is your best option for attaching or for embedding a file in an assignment, in a page, in any kind of activity that you're designing, because Office 365 documents are basically use the same kind of accessibility checker that Moodle itself uses. And so when you've attached those, they would have gone through a similar accessibility checking platform. It's not that you can't use Google Docs or other options. You certainly can, and there are accessibility checks in there. But there is, for whatever reason, Office 365 has built a certain kind of compatibility with Moodle that allows the accessibility that exists in the document to transfer directly into its embed or its attached state in Moodle. PDFs are tricky. PDFs can be made accessible, but they usually have to be done and checked within the PDF creator that was used to make them. And so if you don't have access to that, that may be a place where you want to get in touch with an instructional designer or with someone else at your institution. So it's not that you shouldn't use PDFs. You absolutely can use PDFs, but I always like to say, be careful with PDFs because they can be designed in ways that aren't accessible, that don't include a lot of accessible elements in them. And once we've attached them and included them in them, Moodle will not be able to do anything with that, right? So the Office 365 documents have a great deal of compatibility with Moodle, but PDFs on their own don't typically and have to be made accessible on their own. The Addo editor has a built-in accessibility checker. And this is a great tool, because what it will do is when you click it, it will look through everything you've coded into the text editor, and it will find all of the issues that we've just been talking about, and maybe even some others, right? And highlight those for you and tell you what those are. And then it will guide you through the process of fixing them. So it's really, really straightforward, and it's an incredible tool to have at your disposal. But again, the Addo text editor is just looking at the accessibility, the text that you put into the text box. Your institutions may have access to a larger scale accessibility toolkit that Moodle, that some people have developed in Moodle. And this is going to take a much broader look at your course as a whole, including some of those more universal design principles that we talked about at the very beginning. So talk to folks at your own institutions. That's not universally available in Moodle, but is in there. And then we're nearing the end of our time, so I want to very quickly talk about this as a sort of last thing. I find it useful when we talk about accessibility to not get lost in the trees and miss out on the greater forest, right? Because the point here is that we want to make the courses that we design as usable as possible for every single person that we assign them to, and that gets to have access to them, right? So usability is not just about the accessibility checklist, but it is about the sort of totality of how our learners are able to take advantage of what we give them, right? And usability is rooted very much in this idea of empathy. We want to design things with our learners and our students in mind. We want to improve and streamline the experience that learners and users have, so that we can increase the value that they get from that, right? And again, I mentioned this very briefly at the beginning, but when we talk about usable design, we're actually talking about things that aren't intuitive. Because we don't want to rely on intuition. Intuition seems like it's innate, but actually it depends on certain sort of standard senses and learned ways of perceiving and understanding that not everybody may have access to, right? So usable design actually doesn't rely on any sort of intuitivity, but rather it's the opposite. It is all about intentionality. It's all about being explicit and clear in design and configuration. And so the last thing I would want to leave you with is, when we think about accessibility, it's not just about meeting standards of the grant. It's not just about making sure that the accessibility checker in our tools in Moodle gives us the thumbs up and says that we're in the all clear. It really is about maximizing the usability for the broadest number of our students and our learners as we possibly can. Okay, we're at the end of our time, and so I want to honor that. And if people need to drop off, that's totally fine. But I do also want to make sure that we've got some opportunity if folks have questions or comments, and that can be super specific around Moodle stuff. I'm not a super Moodle expert, but we have Edward with this. He probably is and can answer most things. Or if it's just about more broadly some of the accessibility stuff. But I'd love to hear any questions you've got, or any comments that you've had, or experiences that you've had. And I'm happy to stick around for as long as possible.
I've got a question, if you don't mind here.
No, great. Yeah, please do.
So, in your experiences, what is the best way to kind of experiment and test, these changes that might be made to content, and to like really test to see what a user that requires those accessibility features, for example, like a screen reader, like what would be a recommended way for testing out any changes made and seeing how what the output is?
Okay, that's a great question. I think this is one of those places where we really can trust the accessibility checkers, or the accessibility checker that's built into the Addo editor that Moodle has. So for example, anytime we're building content into, we're building a page or an assignment or any kind of activity where we're in the text editor or the HTML, that accessibility checker, that's precisely what it's doing, is it's running through all of the text that you've just put in there as if it were a screen reader. And it's going to flag anywhere that a screen reader is going to get tripped up. So that does the work for you. So you don't necessarily need to simulate that. I mean, there are probably ways that you can find a screen reader so that you can experience what it does, but the accessibility checker itself is operating as if that were the case. But what I like about your question, and one thing I think I would tack on to a trick that I think is useful, is if we're using an external place or tool to create the content, and then we're bringing the content into, in other words, if you're not just typing straight from my head into the text editor in Moodle, but I'm writing a Word document or I'm working in PowerPoint. One thing that I recommend is get rid of all of the formatting before you bring your content into your text editor, and only do formatting in the text editor in Moodle. Because anytime you're importing formatting from outside of Moodle and then bringing it in, you're running the risk that the accessibility checker either is going to miss something that you brought in there, or it's going to force you to change it anyway. And I know what I just said, because the official line is that that Office 365 documents go through their own accessibility checking, that you can import those in. And I think that's great when you're just attaching a document. But my typical experience is that if you're copying and pasting out of Word or out of Google Docs, and it's if you format it and then copy paste it and bring it in, somehow you're always going to, and this is more true for Moodle, in fact, than I think it is for Canvas. Somehow you're going to end up, it's going to run afoul, and the headings may not always translate the right way. If you bolded it, italicized, all that kind of stuff, even that might get sort of thrown off a little bit out of whack. So you can trust the accessibility checker in the auto editor to point out the things that a screen reader is going to struggle with. But the best way to get there is on the front end, which is if you're writing in Google Docs or if you're writing in Word, don't do any formatting. You maybe make notes for yourself. So if you've got headings, in parentheses, put H2 or large or whatever, but don't even format it as heading. And then when you copy and paste, do all of your formatting right there in the auto editor, because that way what the checker is looking is everything you've done right there in the page, and it's not going to get tripped up on something that you formatted in a separate source. If that makes any sense.
Oh no, yeah, no, definitely. I mean, you'd be surprised how much damage you can do just by doing a copy paste. Because when you do that, I mean, I've seen it firsthand, right? You go to a website, an instructor sees something, they're like, oh yeah, this is cool information. They copy paste it. But what they don't know is it carries the CSS behind it too, and then it just creates a mess. On the
No, it really is
page.
True, and you know this well, but HTML is pretty straightforward for the most. Getting the CSS, it's a dialect, right? And so some platforms are using different versions of CSS tags, and when you try to pull those into Moodle, it's going to read them differently and it's going to interpret them differently, and then you're going to get all out of whack. This is especially the case for tables, and if it were entirely up to me, I'd just get rid of tables, because they really are, or they can become really cumbersome. But the auto editor in Moodle allows you to build a table in Moodle. And so what I would want to say to anybody is, if you want a table, you can build it in Word. If you need to sample it out, sketch it out on a sheet of paper. But when it comes to actually building the table, make sure you build it in Moodle using the table building tool, because that's how you're going to be able to input your captions and your headings in ways that the accessibility checker wants you to. If you bring in from outside and you just copy and paste it in there, most likely you're going to end up with something that's a mess. And that's where you end up with these tables that have like 3 captions and all kinds of headings. And so when you're looking at it, it'll say, course contents, but it'll say it 3 different times. And a screen reader is just going to jumble that up, and that's going to be super confusing to your learners who are using that. So my big thing is, if you want to use a blank thing like Google Docs to experiment, that's great. Just make sure you're not bringing any formatting in. You're just bringing plain text in, and then do all of your formatting right there in the text editor.
Right. Yeah. And well, back when I went through my whole HTML training and stuff like that, it was explained that HTML has evolved with semantics in mind, right? And so just correctly configuring, you know, all the, you know, and making sure you get the meaning of information correctly on your page. But yeah, you know, and that's just the thing is like so far I've just been running on faith and saying like, okay, well, I know if I use the EM tag, you know, it's going to do its job if once someone uses a screen reader. But I guess yeah, I mean, my whole thing is just like, yeah, you know, I'm told that this will work, but you know, I tend to lean too much into the whole trust but verify principle here.
Right.
So I was just kind of, yeah, looking to see if there's you know, probably some neat way of actually testing that out and seeing what the output of that is. But all right, cool. Yeah, no, I mean, this was good info. This is definitely something I'll take into consideration and kind of relay to instructors and other
Okay.
staff
Yeah,
here. But no, good stuff. Yeah,
that's
appreciate it.
great. That's great. Michael, I saw that you had a comment. I wasn't able to follow the chat real well.
Oh, I'm just, you know, I really don't have much experience with Moodle. So I'm just hoping to gain what I can.
Right.
Yeah.
I think that, especially with 4.0, I think Moodle has really come a long way in the last, say, 5 years. And is so much easier to use for this kind of stuff. I mean, Moodle was always, I think, intended to be very accessible. But I think it's done a really, really good job in the last few years and the last few iterations that it's released, in making the accessibility just so simple to get, in terms of using the checker, making sure all the basic stuff's there. But again, in my experience doing course reviews at Yavapai, and of course we're in Canvas, but Canvas is built on the same platform that Moodle is, and so in many ways it's the same kind of stuff. My experience is that even when we get through the checker okay, there often are some conceptual things that are going on, or design things, and that's why I like to focus on really kind of the big picture behind what the checker is doing and why the checker is doing that. Because again, this idea that we want to design robustly so that when technology does move forward, the stuff that we've already created will also move forward with it, really has to do with understanding, why are we chunking the material this way? Why are we using headings the way we use them? Why do we build the links the way that we do? Because that's what's going to travel forward. So I think Moodle is a fantastic tool, and I think it makes accessibility easy to accomplish in a lot of ways. So. Great. Well, hey, I know we're over time, and I want to honor that. If you guys have more questions or want to chat, I've got all day, but I don't want to keep you guys because I know that there's the day is waning on, and there's probably lots of things to do. So,
No, I appreciate it, Micah. It was nice meeting you.
hey, it was great to meet you too. I'm glad to get connected, Edward, and I'm sure that we'll have occasion to talk about other things too on down the road here. So,
yeah, definitely.
And Michael, always good to see you.
Thank you for the information. This is good. Thank you.
Yep. Okay, great. Thank you so much, guys.
All right, see you.
Okay, bye-bye.